So, hello students, and let us begin with a very important topic, that's the dural venous sinuses and the cavernous sinus. Right? Now we know this dura mater. Dura mater. The dura mater splits into two parts, into two layers. Now, who's outside the dura mater? The skull, the endosteum of the skull. And who's on the inner side of dura mater? The arachnoid matter. Right? So if this is dura, outside is the skull, endosteum of the skull. On this side is the arachnoid matter. Now this dura mater, it splits into two layers. One layer goes close to the endosteum of the skull, that's the endosteal layer, and the second layer is known as the meningeal layer. So the dura mater divides into an endosteal and a meningeal layer. It encloses a space within it, and this space is known as a sinus, dural sinus. So sinus is a space. And these sinuses are filled with venous blood. They're filled with venous blood. So all the sinuses located within the skull, within the dura mater, are therefore known as the dural venous sinuses. Dural venous sinuses. Okay. So the topic is dural venous sinuses. These are spaces within the dura mater filled with venous blood. So the dural venous sinuses. Have a look at this topic. Now, this is a fold of dura mater which is going to separate the two cerebral hemisphere. This fold of dura mater separates the two cerebral hemispheres. Like if you try to understand this, one moment. Okay, so that's how the section of the brain that I'm drawing here for you. Right. So what is this? That's the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum. Now this fold of dura mater is attached. The lower border of this fold is attached to the corpus callosum. The upper margin, okay, so this is the fold, this is the falx cerebri. The upper part of this fold is attached to the skull. It is attached to the skull. It splits here. It splits and it is attached to this suture, the sagittal suture of the skull. So this fold of dura mater, on the lower side, it is attached to the corpus callosum. On the upper side, it splits and it is attached to the sagittal suture of the skull. It encloses a sinus above, just below the sagittal suture, that's the superior sagittal sinus, and it encloses a sinus above the corpus callosum along its lower border, that's the inferior sagittal sinus. So superior sagittal sinus is here on the superior border of falx cerebri. Inferior sagittal sinus is on the lower border of the falx cerebri above the corpus callosum. Clear? And what is this falx cerebri? It separates the two cerebral hemispheres. Perfect. Clear? Now just try to understand this. So what is this? You can see this cut part. You can see this and you can see this. So this is a section, no? So this sinus would begin from here. It would come like this. It would come back here. So that's the superior sagittal sinus. It would begin from front. It would run behind here. Now it would go to the right side. It goes to the right side. Students, we know what is this. This is what we call as the right transverse sinus. You know this transverse sinus, we've seen this. Now this transverse sinus becomes an S. What is this known as? The sigmoid sinus. So the superior sagittal sinus continues as the right transverse, continues as the right sigmoid sinus. Now this sigmoid sinus leaves the skull through the posterior compartment of the jugular foramen. Clear? It leaves the skull through the posterior compartment of the jugular foramen. It gets outside the skull. It is now known as the internal jugular vein. It's now known as internal jugular vein. So students, what is internal jugular vein? It's a continuation of the sigmoid sinus. The sigmoid sinus continues as the internal jugular vein. Clear? Look, the superior sagittal sinus here, that becomes the right transverse, the right sigmoid, and the right internal jugular vein. Clear? Now, what is the sinus located here? It was beginning from here and it was coming back here. So that's the inferior sagittal sinus. It's a small sinus along the lower border of the falx cerebri. Begins from here, comes back here. Now, what is this fold of dura mater? You can see this fold of dura mater. It is going to separate the... One moment, I'll just draw this for you. Look, I'll draw it like this. So that's the brain. That's a brain. This is the midbrain, that's a pons, that's a medulla, yeah. And what's here? Cerebellum. What's here? Cerebellum. Now this fold of dura mater is going to separate the occipital lobe of the brain. Yeah, the occipital lobe of the brain from the cerebellum. The cerebellum would lie below this. Here would lie the cerebellum. And who would lie above this? Above this would lie the occipital lobe of the cerebral cortex, occipital lobe of the cerebrum. So this fold of dura mater separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum, and this is acting as a tent. We call this as the tentorium cerebelli. Tentorium cerebelli, clear? So this tentorium cerebelli is a fold of dura mater which separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Now this inferior sagittal sinus would run from here, it would come back here. Now it has to reach behind, it has to come behind. So it runs in the tentorium cerebelli as the straight sinus. So this sinus that we are looking at, this is what we call as the straight sinus. Clear? So inferior sagittal sinus first becomes a straight sinus, now goes to the left side. It becomes the left transverse, then left sigmoid, and the left internal jugular vein. That's the same thing. Let me just write this down for you so it will be clear. So we'll make it like this. The superior sagittal sinus. Okay, superior sagittal sinus continues as the right transverse sinus. Okay, I'll just put a S for sinus. So the superior sagittal sinus continues as the right transverse. The right transverse becomes the right sigmoid sinus, and the right sigmoid sinus gets out through the posterior compartment of the jugular foramen. It becomes the right internal jugular vein. Clear? Now coming to the next sinus, can I write it on this side? Okay, so I'll write it on this side. The inferior sagittal sinus. Okay, I'll write it here. That's the inferior sagittal sinus. Inferior sagittal sinus first becomes what? Straight sinus. The straight sinus becomes the left transverse. Sinus. Now it continues as left sigmoid, and then it continues as the left internal jugular vein. Clear? So inferior sagittal sinus first becomes the straight sinus, then becomes the left transverse, then left sigmoid, and left internal jugular vein. Perfect. So these are the various sinuses of the skull located within the dura mater. Now we come to the largest sinus. Have a look at this. Okay, so what is this? Have a look at this. What is this? That's a superior sagittal sinus. That's an inferior sagittal sinus. This becomes a straight sinus. Okay, so the superior sagittal sinus becomes the right transverse, the right sigmoid, and the right internal jugular vein. Clear? Now we come to a big sinus here. Have a look at this. We come to a very large sinus. Just one moment. Okay, look at this slide. Now, students, what is this, you tell me? What is this? That's a lesser wing of sphenoid, correct? What is this? The petrous part of temporal bone. Where are we? What is this fossa? The middle cranial fossa. That's a middle cranial fossa. In the middle cranial fossa, extending from the lesser wing of sphenoid to the petrous part of temporal bone, we have a very big sinus. We have been discussing this right from the first lecture. That's the largest sinus. This is the cavernous sinus. Right, so where is the cavernous sinus located? In the middle cranial fossa. What is the extent of cavernous sinus? It extends from the lesser wing of sphenoid to the petrous part of temporal bone. Right, so what is this wall of the cavernous sinus? Lateral wall. What is this wall? Medial wall. Above is the roof and below is the floor of the cavernous sinus. Okay, students, now just try to understand the relations of the cavernous sinus. I told you, any structure, if it has to go to the orbit, what is the way to get into the orbit? From the skull, if any structure has to go to the orbit, there's only one way to go into the orbit. That's a superior orbital fissure, correct? Now, any structure going towards the orbit has to pass from here. Any structure going towards the orbit has to cross this, has to pass from here. So any structure going towards the orbit as a rule will be related to what? The cavernous sinus. You understanding? Any structure going towards the orbit or going towards the superior orbital fissure as a rule will be related to the cavernous sinus. Now, which wall is this? Lateral wall of cavernous sinus. That's the lateral wall of cavernous sinus. So who was going to the orbit? The third nerve, the fourth nerve, the ophthalmic division of trigeminal nerve. The sixth has got some problem, I'll tell you that. So this will be the relations in the lateral wall of cavernous sinus. Clear? What lies in the medial wall? What is this for? That's for the pituitary gland, sila turcica. So the medial relation of the cavernous sinus is the sila turcica. Okay. Just let me draw this cavernous sinus for you. Have a look at this. I'll make this as the cavernous sinus. Look, I'll make this as a cavernous sinus. We've taken a section here. So what's on the medial side here of the cavernous sinus? That's a pituitary gland here. And just below the pituitary gland, we get a air sinus. That's an air sinus below the sphenoid. This is what we call as the sphenoidal air sinus. Sphenoidal air sinus. And what is this? That's a pituitary gland. Okay, so this becomes the medial relation of the cavernous sinus, medial relation. In the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, what do we have? In the lateral wall, that's a third nerve, that's a fourth nerve, that's the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve, And who was supposed to come here? The sixth nerve was supposed to come here, but someone else comes here. Someone who's going towards the foramen rotundum. Come on, can you answer this? There's someone who's going towards the foramen rotundum. What's that nerve? That's a maxillary nerve. The maxillary nerve comes to line the lateral wall. And because the maxillary nerve comes to line the lateral wall, it is going to push the sixth nerve down here. So what is this nerve? That's the sixth nerve. So sixth nerve comes to line the floor on the lateral side. And in the floor, there's a very big artery here. There's a foramen which lies in the floor of the cavernous sinus. That's the foramen lacerum. Or you can say the cavernous sinus is sitting on the foramen lacerum, and there's a big artery entering the skull through the foramen lacerum. We've seen this. That's the internal carotid artery. So when the internal carotid artery enters the skull, it lies in the floor of cavernous sinus. So what is this? Internal carotid artery. So in the floor of cavernous sinus lies the sixth nerve and the internal carotid artery. In the lateral wall is the third, fourth, ophthalmic and the maxillary division. On the medial side is the pituitary gland and the sphenoidal air sinus. And in the roof of the cavernous sinus, this is the optic chiasma. Okay, that's the optic chiasma. Optic chiasma that lies in the roof of the cavernous sinus. Okay, so clear? I hope this relations of the cavernous sinus are very clear to you. And then the structures will, what is lying in front here? If I draw something like this here for you, what is lying here? That's a superior orbital fissure. And this structures would be getting into the orbit through the superior orbital fissure. Clear to all of you students? Fine, very good. Now, just try to understand this. Cavernous sinus is like a reservoir of blood, right? It's like a storehouse of the blood. So there are veins which are coming towards the sinus. There are veins which are bringing blood towards the cavernous sinus. And there are veins which will take blood away from the cavernous sinus. Those which are bringing blood towards the cavernous sinus, we would call them as tributaries of cavernous sinus, tributaries. And the ones which are taking blood away from the cavernous sinus, we would call them as the draining channels, right? So just try to understand what I'm telling you. There are a lot of controversies on this. Tributaries of cavernous sinus. Okay, I'll just mention this for you. Tributaries of cavernous sinus. Tributaries of cavernous sinus. I'll write in short, tributaries. So there are three sources from where the tributaries come from. One is from the orbit. Second one is from the meninges. And the third one is from the brain. Okay, so these are the three sources which from where the blood is going to come into this cavernous sinus. So which are the veins which are coming from the orbit? Students, we have seen this. Yes, you can answer this. We have seen this. You remember the dangerous area of face, the lower part of the nose and the upper lip. How does the infection go to the cavernous sinus? From here, the infection first goes to the facial vein, then from the facial vein through the angular vein. From the angular vein, there's a vein which is communicating with the cavernous sinus. What's that? The superior ophthalmic vein. Very good, students. Excellent. Excellent. You're answering very well. So that's the superior ophthalmic vein which is coming towards the cavernous sinus. And this superior ophthalmic vein is bringing infection from the dangerous area to the cavernous sinus. So yes, this becomes the tributary of the cavernous sinus. From the orbit, the first vein is the superior ophthalmic vein. The second vein is the inferior ophthalmic vein. inferior ophthalmic vein, and the third is the central vein of retina. Central vein of retina. So you get MCQs on this, tributaries of cavernous sinus, draining channels of cavernous sinus. So that's the superior ophthalmic vein, inferior ophthalmic vein, and the central vein of retina. From the meninges, what is a vein which comes from the meninges? There is a sphenoparietal sinus. Sphenoparietal sinus. That is the one which comes from the meninges, right? And what is the one which comes from the brain? There are two veins which comes from the brain. One is the superficial, okay, superficial middle cerebral vein, superficial middle cerebral vein, and the second one is the deep cerebral vein, inferior cerebral vein. I'm so sorry. Second one is the inferior cerebral vein. Just remember what I've told you, students. There's a lot of confusion and a lot of controversies on this. So just remember this: tributaries of cavernous sinus are very important MCQ. We classify tributaries as into three sources. One is from the orbit, one is from the meninges, one is from the brain. So from the orbit, the superior ophthalmic, inferior ophthalmic, the central vein of retina. From the meninges, the sphenoparietal sinus. That's a vein. And from the brain, superficial middle cerebral vein and the inferior cerebral vein. These becomes the tributaries of cavernous sinus. Clear, students? Now, understand the draining channels. Draining channels meaning the veins which are taking blood from the cavernous sinus, Now, just have a look at this. Now, students, try to understand this. So, we have seen this in the previous lecture. What is this bone? What is this bone? That's a petrous part of the temporal bone, petrous part. And on this petrous part of the temporal bone, there are two sinuses, one along the superior border, one along the inferior border. Along the superior border is the superior petrosal sinus. Along the inferior border is the inferior petrosal sinus. Clear? So the superior petrosal sinus and the inferior petrosal sinus. Clear to all of you? Okay, so what is this sinus? That's a transverse sinus. That's the cavernous sinus. So who's connecting the cavernous sinus to the transverse sinus? That's the superior petrosal sinus. So the superior petrosal sinus is going to take the blood from the cavernous sinus to the transverse sinus. Clear? Now this transverse sinus then becomes what? What is this S-shaped sinus here? That's a sigmoid sinus. And there's a vein which would connect the cavernous sinus to the sigmoid sinus. Okay. Or there's a vein which would connect the cavernous sinus with the internal jugular vein. That's the inferior petrosal sinus. So inferior petrosal sinus connects the cavernous sinus to either the sigmoid sinus or the internal jugular vein. I'll tell you that. Now, these two cavernous sinuses are connected. You can see this connection in front and this connection behind here. So this is what we call as, this is what we call as the anterior intercavernous sinus, and this is what we call as the posterior intercavernous sinus. So the two cavernous sinuses are connected in front and behind by the anterior and the posterior intercavernous sinus. And this cavernous sinus is also connected to the pterygoid venous plexus. Remember the dangerous area of phase? Through an emissary vein, Clear, students? So just remember this draining channels, another very important MCQ for you, the draining channels. You're clear now? So that's the draining channel. So draining channel meaning it would take blood from the cavernous sinus. So the superior petrosal sinus, superior petrosal sinus drains the cavernous sinus to transverse sinus. Clear? I hope I'm clear to all of you. Drains the cavernous sinus to transverse sinus. Second, inferior petrosal sinus. Inferior petrosal sinus drains the cavernous sinus to sigmoid sinus or internal jugular vein. See, whatever option is there. If internal jugular vein is in the option, take it as internal jugular vein. That's the first thing. Why, students, why? Because look, just try to understand this. Now, what is this foramen? That's a jugular foramen. That's a posterior compartment, middle compartment, anterior compartment of the jugular foramen. Now, what is this sinus? The sigmoid sinus enters the posterior compartment, now becomes what? What is this going to be? Internal jugular vein. Okay, that's the internal jugular vein, a continuation of sigmoid sinus. What is coming through the anterior compartment of the jugular foramen? Yes, through the anterior compartment comes the inferior petrosal sinus. So when the inferior petrosal sinus gets out through the anterior compartment of the jugular foramen, it's outside the skull, correct? So what is it going to join? What is it going to join? Internal jugular vein. You understanding? So inferior petrosal sinus gets out of the jugular foramen. The sigmoid sinus gets out of the jugular foramen. So what is the inferior petrosal sinus going to join? Your first answer is internal jugular vein. Your first answer should be internal jugular vein. So drains the cavernous sinus to, let me make this correction here, drains the cavernous sinus to internal jugular vein. In fact, you get an MCQ stating the first tributary of cavernous sinus is the first tributary, I'm so sorry, the first tributary of internal jugular vein is, your answer is inferior petrosal sinus. The first tributary of internal jugular vein is inferior petrosal sinus. If inferior petrosal sinus is not there, so inferior petrosal sinus connects the cavernous sinus to internal jugular vein. If internal jugular vein is not in the option is going to be the sigmoid sinus. Suppose by chance, if it doesn't get out of the skull, inside the skull, it will join with the sigmoid sinus. Just remember that, right? So that's the second draining channel. The third draining channel, the two cavernous sinus are connected by, anterior and posterior intercavernous sinus. The two cavernous sinus are connected by anterior and posterior intercavernous sinus, and fourth drains into pterygoid venous plexus, through emissary vein. Through an emissary vein. Look, from the cavernous sinus, the infection goes, from the pterygoid venous plexus, the infection goes to the cavernous sinus. It can come in the reverse direction also. These are all valveless. So it connects with the pterygoid venous plexus to the emissary vein. Clear to all of you students? Cavernous sinus. So first in this lecture, I've told you what are dural venous sinuses, what is dura mater, how it splits into two layers, endosteal layer and meningeal layer. Between them, it encloses a space which is known as sinus filled with venous blood. So dural venous sinus. We have got a sinus running on the upper border of falx cerebri, below the superior sagittal sinus, below the sagittal suture. That's the superior sagittal sinus. The superior sagittal sinus goes to the right side. That's the right transverse, the right sigmoid and the right internal jugular vein. Inferior sagittal sinus first becomes the straight sinus, then the left transverse, the left sigmoid and the left internal jugular vein. Then we studied the relations of the cavernous sinus. Relations in the lateral wall are very important, and floor, third nerve, fourth nerve, ophthalmic and maxillary division. In the floor is the sixth nerve and the internal carotid artery. Medially is the pituitary gland, and just below the pituitary gland, which is the bone in which the pituitary gland lies, sphenoid. So below that is the sphenoidal air sinus, and in the roof is the optic chiasma. After that, I told you the tributaries of cavernous sinus. So tributaries, I told you, just remember that flow chart. And finally, I told you the draining channels of the cavernous sinus, how the blood gets out from the cavernous sinus to its various tributaries, through its various draining channels. Clear to all of you? Look at this slide, if you can understand this slide here. Now, what is this number 1? I'll just put numbers here. You identify this number 1, that's the superior sagittal sinus. What is this number 2? That's the right transverse sinus. What is this number 3? That's the right sigmoid sinus. And number 4 is the right internal jugular vein. What is this number 5? That's the superior petrosal sinus, which is connecting the cavernous sinus. Number 6 is the cavernous sinus. So the superior petrosal sinus connects the cavernous sinus to transverse sinus, right? What is this? I'll put this in a different color. So what's this? Number 1 here, that's the inferior sagittal sinus. Number 2 is the straight sinus. Number 3 is the left transverse, left sigmoid, and the left internal jugular vein. I hope this is clear to all of you. Okay, answer this MCQ, students. So there are different sinuses. Some of them are paired, some of them are unpaired sinuses. So superior petrosal sinus lies on both the sides, so that's a paired sinus. Inferior petrosal lies on both the sides, that's a paired sinus. Superior sagittal sinus is a single sinus, unpaired. It's only one. Inferior sagittal sinus is an unpaired sinus. Transverse sinus are paired. Sigmoid sinuses are paired sinuses. Clear? So the answer is superior sagittal sinus, unpaired one. Cavernous sinus is related to all except, what do you say, students? Cavernous sinus, yes. Abducens nerve, where is the abducens nerve related? In the floor of the cavernous sinus. Pituitary gland, yes, on the medial side. Mandibular nerve, no. Oculomotor nerve, yes, in the lateral wall. So mandibular nerve is not related to the cavernous sinus. Remember, students, a very important MCQ, mandibular nerve is much away from the cavernous sinus. What is there in the lateral wall? Third nerve, fourth nerve, ophthalmic, and the maxillary division of trigeminal nerve. It's maxillary, not the mandibular. Mandibular nerve is much away from the cavernous sinus, much away. Fine. Answer this. Tributaries of cavernous sinus are all except. Yes, what do you say, students? Tributaries of cavernous sinus are all except. Inferior cerebral vein, yes, it comes from the brain. Central vein of retina, yes, it comes from the orbit. Spinoparietal sinus comes from the meninges. Superior cerebral vein is not there. It is an inferior cerebral vein, which is a tributary of cavernous sinus. Clear, students? Any doubts you have, you tell me. So students, I hope this lecture is clear to all of you. Cavernous sinus, a very important topic. So just remember this. Once again, I'm telling you the dangerous area of face, the lower part of the nose and the upper lip. Okay, in 2 minutes, I'll just draw this dangerous area of face for you. Have a look at this. Okay, just quickly, I'll draw this. So we had drawn this as the dangerous area of the face. You remember the slide? That's the body of the mandible, that's the ramus, that's the angle of the mandible. Now, what are these veins? What are these veins? Supraorbital, supratrochlear vein joins to form the angular vein, continues as facial vein. That's a superficial temporal, that's a maxillary, that's a retromandibular, anterior posterior division, joining with facial to form the common facial vein, and this common facial vein drains into internal jugular vein. The posterior division of retromandibular vein joining with a vein coming from behind the ear, that's the external jugular vein, and this external jugular vein drains into the subclavian vein. Clear to all of you? Now, which part of the face is the dangerous area of the face? The lower part of the nose and the upper lip. How does the infection from here go to the cavernous sinus? So, from the dangerous area, first to the facial vein to the angular vein, and from the angular vein, there's a vein which goes to the cavernous sinus. What is this? That's a superior ophthalmic vein, and this superior ophthalmic vein is one of the tributary of cavernous sinus. We've seen this. What is this now? That's a pterygoid venous plexus. How does the infection go here to the cavernous sinus? From the dangerous area, first to the facial vein to the deep facial vein, from deep facial vein to the pterygoid venous plexus, and pterygoid venous plexus to the cavernous sinus through the emissary vein, right? So this were the two ways of spread of infection from the dangerous area of the face to the cavernous sinus. And if this cavernous sinus is infected, it will result in a cavernous sinus thrombosis. And now the person will have the eyeballs get out, they come out. What is that known as? Exophthalmos. And the internal carotid artery is passing through the floor of the cavernous sinus. So the eyeball is going to pulsate with the beat of internal carotid artery, and this is what we call as a pulsating exophthalmos. So if there's a thrombosis of the cavernous sinus, the eyeball protrudes out, that's exophthalmos, and it beats with the heartbeat, with the beat of internal carotid artery. So that is what we call as pulsating exophthalmos, a complication of thrombosis of the cavernous sinus. Clear, students? I hope this topic is clear to all of you. Yes. Any doubts? In case of doubts, do get back to me. Okay. Thank you to all of you. Thank you and happy learning. Thank you.